Chapter 11, the final chapter of The House with a Clock in Its Walls. 3 days after the destruction of Mrs. Izzard and her magic clock, Jonathan, Mrs. Zimmerman, and Louis were sitting around a bonfire in the driveway of the house at 100 High Street. It was a chilly night, and the stars were cold overhead, but the fire burned a warm, bright orange. Mrs. Zimmerman had a steaming earthenware pot of cocoa by her side. She kept it close to the fire so it would stay warm. Jonathan and Louis stared at the fire and sipped cocoa from their mugs. It tasted very good. There was a pile of Isaac Izzard's dusty papers in Jonathan's lap. Every now and then he would pick one up and throw it into the fire. Louis watched each sheet as the fire licked at its corners, then blackened it, then wadded it into a fluffy ball of ashes. After a while, Louis said, "Uncle Jonathan." "Yes, Louis?" "Was Mrs. Izzard really trying to make the world end?" "As far as I can tell, she was," said Jonathan. "And she would have done it, too, if you hadn't fixed her clock for her. But tell me, Louis, why didn't you turn around when we did?" Louis smiled broadly. "I looked at the glass door on the clock, and I saw the reflection of what Mrs. Izzard was holding, and I knew it was a hand of glory." "John L. Stoddard tells you all about hands of glory." "I'm glad he does," said Mrs. Zimmerman. "One look at that hand, and you would have been as numb as we were. But still, it took a great deal of courage for you to rush in and smash the clock. After all, you didn't know what would happen to you when you did that." Louis was silent. He had always thought that courage had something to do with riding your bicycle through bonfires and hanging by your knees from the limbs of trees. Mrs. Zimmerman picked up a plate of chocolate chip cookies and passed them around. Jonathan took 2 and Louis took several. There was another silence while everyone munched and sipped for a while. Jonathan threw more papers into the fire. Louis squirmed around and stared at the dark house across the street. "Do you think Mrs. Izzard could ever come back?" he said in a faltering voice. "No," said Jonathan, shaking his head gravely. "No, Louis, I think when you smashed the clock in the walls, you destroyed any power she might have in this world. Just to be on the safe side, though, I put what was left of her back in the mausoleum and locked the doors with a nice, shiny new lock. A lock that has had spells set over it. That ought to hold her for a while." "What about the Hanchets?" said Louis. "I mean, are they going to come back to live in their house?" Jonathan paused for a minute before speaking. He clicked the paper clips on his watch chain. "I think they are," he said at last. "But certain rites will have to be performed before they can return. When an unclean spirit inhabits a house, it leaves behind a bad aura." "Speaking of bad auras and unclean spirits," said Mrs. Zimmerman, "do you have any idea what happened to Hammerhandle?" Jonathan's face grew grim for an instant. He had made a few guesses about Hammerhandle's fate, but he had kept them to himself. For one thing, he knew that the blood of a hanged man went into the making of a hand of glory. "No idea at all," said Jonathan, shaking his head. "He seems to have vanished from the face of the earth." Suddenly, Louis began to squirm and scrunch around in his seat again. He was on the brink of saying something. "Uncle Jonathan?" Louis's voice was dry and throaty. "Yes, Louis, what is it?" I let Mrs. Izzard out of her tomb." Jonathan smiled calmly. "Yes," he said, "I knew you did." Louis's mouth dropped open. "How did you know?" "You left your flashlight up at the cemetery. I found it in the pile of leaves when I went up to put Mrs. Izzard back in her tomb." "Are you going to send me to the detention home?" asked Louis in a tiny, frightened voice. "Am I going to do what?" said Jonathan, staring at him in disbelief. "Louis, what kind of ogre do you think I am?" "And besides," Jonathan added with a sudden smile, "why should I punish you for doing what I tried to do myself when I was a boy? Like you, I was interested in magic at an early age. It runs in our family, I guess. I was trying to impress a girl. You wanted to keep Tarby for a friend, isn't that right?" Louis nodded sadly. "By the way, Louis," said Mrs. Zimmerman, "how are things between you and Tarby these days?" "Not so good," said Louis. "I don't think Tarby and I were meant to be friends. We're not the same type. But it doesn't matter." "Doesn't matter," said Jonathan. "Well, it certainly does matter. If he's such a stuck-up little—" He stopped because he saw that Louis was smiling smugly. Jonathan wrinkled up his eyebrows so that they looked like 2 mating auburn caterpillars. Louis Barnevelt, he roared, are you hiding something from me? Louis is trying very hard to keep from giggling. Oh, nothing much, Uncle Jonathan, he said, except that I have a new friend. What? You do? Said Jonathan and Mrs. Zimmerman in unison. Yes. Her name is Rita Pottinger, and she lives down on Mansion Street. She knows the names of all the different kinds of cannon. Want to hear them? Saker, Minion, Falconet, Demi-Culverin. Ah, screamed Jonathan. He threw 2 fitfuls of paper into the fire. That's all I need. An an expert in Elizabethan ordnance. Promise me one thing, Louis. What's that? If you and Tiny Rosie decide to start a cannon foundry in our basement, let Mrs. Zimmerman and me know so we can visit my relatives in OC 5 Hills, okay? Louis giggled. Sure, Uncle Jonathan. I'll let you know. Jonathan waved his pipe at the bonfire. The leaves stirred uneasily, and then they gathered into a large black ball. The bonfire turned into a jack-o'-lantern. Now the 3 of them took turns pitching chestnuts into the eyes, nose, and mouth of the ferocious lantern. Pop, pop, pop. The chestnuts went off in a ripping string, like the fusillade of musket fire. Jonathan, Louis, and Mrs. Zimmerman sat around the fire, talking until the scowling orange face fell in with an airy whoosh. Then they got up, stretched, and went wearily off to bed. The end. All right, guys. Thanks for hanging out, reading this story.